All right, you guys. So we want to go back to the very beginning and think about women in colonial America. And one of the big distinctions that we made at this part of history was between these two early regions, like the New England colonies and the Chesapeake Bay. And we know that in New England, we had really traditional family structure. People come across in family units, and they live much as they had back in England or in Europe. They follow the laws of coverture, which, if you remember, was the practice of the so-called covered woman. So a woman's legal identity was always covered by the man in her life. So before she was married, a woman's legal identity is simply assumed by her father. So any property she were to inherit or any agreement she would need to get involved in, her father would be responsible for all of those things. She wouldn't own anything herself. And then once a woman is married, then her legal identity is transferred now to be under that of her husband's. So again, any property she might inherit, any contract she might need to enter into, any legal problem, that would all fall under her husband's legal identity. So that was pretty traditional, but in the Chesapeake Bay, it looked a little bit different. And you might remember that there was a really skewed gender imbalance, right? 6 to 1, 6 men for every 1 woman coming to the Chesapeake Bay colonies in the early years. And this gave women a fairly significant amount of power. So of course, many women died in childbirth, but those who survived could expect to, first of all, be married more than once, right? If their husbands died, then they were likely to remarry. But because they were in sort of such high demand, and there were a lot more political benefits or rights and privileges afforded to women in the Chesapeake Bay. For example, they could in some circumstances file for divorce. They could own property. They could inherit. And these were, it seems sort of stupid that, like, that's exciting. Women can own property, oh wow. But it was certainly much different than in New England. And so the idea or the notion that women might be independent legal entities sort of is really begun by necessity, kind of, in the Chesapeake, where their status and sort of their need in the community drove those changes. But we know that leading up to the American Revolution, women are going to play integral roles in family farms, but the Revolution itself, as pretty much every war does, provides a big opportunity for women to sort of break out of their traditional roles. So during the Revolution, as men are away fighting, women are going to have to keep the farms going. They're going to have to be the ones to manage supplies and crops and all of that. And some women take an even more direct role in the Revolution, right? So we see people like Molly Pitcher, who are going to go out on the battlefield, and some will dress as men, and they're going to participate in the actual fighting of the Revolutionary War. So after the Revolution then, there is some notion that women are, if not equal members and citizens of our new country, at the very least they are valuable. And so we see the notion of Republican motherhood, which we've already talked about. This isn't exactly like a resounding support for American women. They're still seen as inferior to men in pretty much every way, but it does at least begin to, like, on a philosophical or ideological level, recognize that women are important, that they have value. So yes, women are still supposed to be at home. All they can do is provide for their husbands and take care of their children. But that job of taking care of their children and raising good Republican sons, that's an important one. So we should value and celebrate that women do have a place in our society. But there isn't much talk of, like, equality. Women are almost nowhere afforded the right to vote, even as we try to democratize how many men can vote. They're really just not included in that. Jane Addams is far ahead of her time when she tells her husband, as he goes off to write the Constitution, remember the ladies, and of course he doesn't, and he thinks it's sort of like a joke. But we're moving a step sort of in the right direction. Then when we move now into the 1830s, the big thing happening in, like, broader U.S. history is the market revolution, right? Remember, that's a transition away from subsistence farming towards producing for a market. And with the market revolution, we see the rise of whole new classes of occupation. So we're not just worried about like just everybody farming in their family. We're also thinking about, we've got bankers, we've got traders, we've got craftsmen, we've got shopkeepers. Like, as we're producing for a market, we have to have a market in which to sell those goods. So we're beginning to see the development of work outside the home, and here's where we get that idea of separate spheres, right? Before the market revolution, all the work happens at home, basically, right? Like, I mean, there's a few craftsmen or like little shops that existed, but for almost everyone, their whole livelihood was all centered around their homestead. It was farming, it was taking care of animals, like everything happened, in this home place. But now, a lot of economic activity is happening outside the home, and so now we get this ideological understanding that women are at the home sphere, the domestic sphere, and men are out in the public sphere. And with this comes the cult of domesticity, which glorifies, if you will, the role that women play in the home. So now, whereas with Republican motherhood, it was like, women, you're not as good as men, but at least you have some good things you can do. Now, with the cult of domesticity, the argument is, actually, women are superior in the domestic sphere. Now, they shouldn't be involved in the public sphere. They should stay separate. But women have this gift at home, and we should glorify them and really support them. But it's kind of interesting because as this ideology rises, right, we begin to see people saying, yeah, we should have this cult of domesticity, like we should glorify women in this role. At the very same time, we actually see more women moving outside the home than ever before, right? Because women are also taking advantage of some of these new economic opportunities. The Lowell Mill is one great example of that. Early American factories employ mostly young women because factory jobs aren't yet seen as like real work. They're not seen as like a real part of the economy. And so women, these sort of fringe workers, they're participating here. And let's be honest, outside of like the upper middle and upper classes, are women really staying home in this domestic sphere all the time? No, we have poor women are domestic servants, they're cooks, they're laundresses. So the reality has never been that the majority of women just sit at home and idly take care of their children. Much less the fact that taking care of children is not idle by any stretch of the imagination. But the ideology that suggests what women ought to do, what they should aspire to do, is there. It's telling that among like slave families who are emancipated or like given manumission before the Civil War, one of the biggest goals, and even after the Civil War, one of the biggest goals for these like freed families is for the wife to be able to stay home. Like that's considered among the black community to be like the sign that you're really free now if your wife doesn't have to work. Because the cultural ideal of like what women should be doing, it's like, wow, we're really free if the man can make enough, can do enough on his own. And of course that ideal is really unrealistic because even poor white families are unlikely to achieve that. Okay, so then sort of as we get a little bit further into the 19th century, we're going to see this idea of the Second Great Awakening, and women's role within the Second Great Awakening is a strong one. So women are going to kind of leverage this philosophy of separate spheres, and they're going to use it as a way to get their hand in some of these public things. So, okay, we're the best at education, then let us be teachers so that we can begin to improve the quality of education of our children. Okay, we're the best at like moral teaching and directing our families. All right, well, let us be in charge of reforming the corruption in prisons and asylums or in politics. Okay, women are supposed to be the best at like teaching and keeping the home pure and like undefiled. Well, let us take the lead in like getting rid of the like problems of alcoholism in our country. So women are going to use that idea of separate spheres to sort of put themselves into the public sphere, but through this idea that women are very different. It's not going to be until the 20th and maybe even the 21st century in some respects that women are going to in any significant way try to argue that they are equal or the same as men. Right? That's like a very modern thing to say. Women of the Second Great Awakening, women of the Progressive Era, women of the 20s, all these women are going to say, we are different from men, and that's why we should be given more privileges, because society needs our perspective. It doesn't, like men are lacking in some way, and we have that like other half of that. Okay, so as part of the Second Great Awakening reforms, we know that the Seneca Falls Convention happens. It's a really big milestone. It's called by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And what have they been doing before the Seneca Falls Convention? Yeah, they were abolitionists. Women were heavily involved in abolition, and so they were prominent leaders of the American Abolitionist Society. They go to England for this international meeting, and they're denied access to the convention. They're told, no, you can go up to the observers gallery. You can't participate. And that made them so angry that they were like, we have got to fight for some equal rights. And so they host this convention. They invite women all from all around the country, and they're making a whole bunch of propositions. So they create this thing called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. So the document that's created by the Seneca Falls Convention is the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And what it says is things like, we demand the right to divorce if we want to. We demand the right to own property. We demand the right to sign contracts. They want nationwide these sort of basic freedoms to be afforded to them. But on a broader plane, these women are asking, or eventually decide, to ask for, the right to vote. And this was controversial. Not everybody at the convention thought that the right to vote was a good idea. But ultimately, a majority of them agreed, no, if we want equal participation in government, we're going to need the right to vote. So here we go. This is what we want. And it's going to take, what? 60 to 71 years before we'll get past. Okay, so then as these women are working, we're going to come to kind of a crossroads after the Civil War. So we passed these Reconstruction Amendments, and in the debate over the ratification for the 15th Amendment, women are really divided. Remember that women had been very active in the abolitionist movement. So like rights for free blacks is a big deal. This is something that they're interested in, that they want. But the 15th Amendment not only excludes women, but adds the word men. No male citizen can be denied the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And this is infuriating. So not only does it not give women what they want, but it specifically excludes them. Right now, they can't even make an argument that they ought to be able to vote because the Constitution now specifically says that they cannot. So some women decide, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, decide this is the so-called Negro's Hour. We're going to support this. We have been fighting for this. It's time for black men to be equal to white men, and women will come next. Other women, on the other hand, are unhappy with this and actually oppose the passage of the 15th Amendment. They say, no, we will not get this. And so some of it is like pride, they're just mad that they're not being included. They want to also get the right. But let's not pretend that there's not some racism involved too. Some women are sort of indignant. How dare we give black men the right to vote and white women can't vote? And actually, some Southerners, this is sort of odd because normally Southerners are pretty conservative, some Southern politicians even begin supporting the idea of women's suffrage because they see it as a counterbalance to black suffrage. So it's like, well, if we're going to give black people the right to vote, we ought to give women the right to vote because then at least we can tell our wives how to vote, and that can help balance out the votes of these black men. So that was sort of a controversial part of the sort of progress in women's history. And this split in the women's movement is just going to get worse. So first it's a split over the 15th Amendment, but then as we move further into like the second half of the 19th century, women's movements are also going to be split over what the goal should be. So some women are going, recognized by the AWSA, the American Women's Suffrage Association, they're going to say, well, what we should do is go after state by state. We should go to each state and get them to add women's suffrage to their constitution. And in the beginning, this solution seems like it's the one that's going to work, because especially at this time, we're adding a whole bunch of western states, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Oregon, Washington. And as we add these new states, many of them include women's suffrage in their constitution. Women are given the right to vote in the West, even when it's not allowed nationwide. So it has to do with like Western culture and like the individualism that exists there, and they're sort of non-traditional. But anyway, it seems like that's working until they kind of run into a wall, right? Like they run out of states that are sort of new, and the older states, the established states that already have state constitutions, they're not willing to go through this big process to try to add women's suffrage. It's just not politically feasible. And so then we sort of see about the balance shifting to the NWSA, the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they're pushing for a constitutional amendment. But they're not making much progress either. So the women's movement's going to kind of stall here after the Civil War for a while. In the progressive era, women are going to do a lot of the same things that happened in the Second Great Awakening. So you should be able to draw some pretty strong parallels. Women are sort of leveraging their role as like this separate spheres called the domesticity. We're better in this area. They're actively involved in reforms, which gets them out into the public. They're in many of the same causes, things like Ida B. Wells and lynching, sort of like civil rights advocacy as compared to like abolition. We move from temperance to prohibition. We see women working to improve poverty conditions, working to improve education for immigrant children, like lots of the same kinds of things. So we get big names here in the progressive era, different muckrakers. We know that Jane Addams and the settlement houses are going to be sort of pushing sociology in this whole new direction. So lots of big efforts there. And finally, after World War I, women will ultimately be successful in passing the 19th Amendment, and we already know about Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul and these organizations. So I want to talk a little bit more about World War I and II. So everything we say, we're mostly going to talk about World War II, and this is mostly true of World War I as well, just to a lesser extent. World War I required a much smaller mobilization. Right, far fewer Americans were involved in World War I than World War II. There were fewer troops that were sent overseas. We didn't have to mobilize to the same extent. Like, it was just a much smaller proposition. But still, in World War I, women are going to have access to some more jobs, and they're going to be encouraged to plant victory gardens. They're cheered as an important part of the war effort. But in World War II, you guys, this takes on a whole new scale, because the level of mobilization of American society is just unprecedented. Millions of men across the country are going off to war. Millions of women now are heads of households. We see millions of jobs, and not just jobs in general, but like men's jobs, welders and machinists and shipbuilders and so on, like pilots and truck drivers. These are jobs that have been always associated with men's roles. These are jobs that are very independent, like women's jobs, have women who worked tended to be in like a servile position. So they were either working in servants of some kind, like as domestic servants or laundresses or whatever, or they were working in like an assistant capacity. So they were nurses or like under the leadership of a doctor, or they're a secretary under the leadership of a whatever. Like they're just serving this sort of like kind of auxiliary role. But now during World War II, the men are gone. The women are taking the lead. They have really big jobs. This not only gives them like a taste of independence, but it also gives them financial independence. So women are being paid well during World War II. They're filling these jobs that men had and being paid almost equivalent to the men that they replaced. So this gives them money that they can play with, they can control, probably for the first time in their life, right? Can you imagine if the freedom that you might feel when you get your first job? Oh, I have money, this is my money, I get to do with it what I want to, maybe. Like that notion is the same sort of like growth that happens for women. And then the military even opens jobs for women. So that we have the WACs, right, the Women's Auxiliary Corps, and the WAVES. So women are now participating in the military. Of course, they're not in combat roles, but they're filling big places. They're ambulance drivers. They're women pilots who like transport planes to like staging grounds at various like European battle theaters. They're serving as coders or decoders of like these different messages. Like they've got all kinds of really important positions. And again, this is going to give them that taste of independence, financial freedom, access to leadership roles. And then the war ends. And men come back from the war, and there is this like very clear cultural shift. We go from posters of Rosie the Riveter, we can do it, to one of my favorite sort of horrific posters is this. They would put it up in shipbuilding factories, and it was the picture was mostly just like two crying children, so like red eyes, like sobbing, all disheveled. And then in the top corner of the picture, all you see is a woman's shoe, like she's leaving. And the like all the words say is, "Mommy, when are you coming home?" And so it's this very targeted message. All right, ladies, thanks for your work. Now go back home. These are men's jobs. You need to give up these jobs and give them back to the men. You need to go back home and fulfill your domestic duties like you're supposed to. This was a special circumstance. Move on. The thing is, that's not really reality. Most women don't go back home, or at least many women don't go back home. We see women's participation in the workforce after World War II higher than it's been at any other point in U.S. history. So many women stay on, either at the same jobs or they find other jobs because they're accustomed to having this income, to providing for their families, and so on. And then the women who go home face this sort of interesting conundrum because society begins to glorify woman's role again as this domestic goddess. So we see like popular television shows like Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best. And what do they show? They show a woman who stays home. She's a housewife. She is fulfilled and happy when she is cleaning and taking care of her children. She serves on the PTO. She never works. Her husband comes home and he gives her all the cares of the day, and she just calmly soothes him. Like, this is what women are supposed to be doing. And there's this tension that exists. And so in 1963, a woman named Betty Friedan, and her name is spelled like this, F-R-I-E-D-A-N, Betty Friedan, she writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique, 1963, she writes this book. And if you're interested in women's studies, I encourage you to read the book. Like, it's actually entertaining to read, mostly because it's horrifying, but it's a good read. And she writes about, basically she's done some sort of like sociological research, and she's looking at women around her, she's listening to research and to interviews that have been done. And one of the titles at the beginning of the book is called The Problem That Has No Name. And she interviews all these women, and they have what seems like everything. They've got good husbands who have good jobs. They live in nice houses in the suburbs. They have beautiful children. Their children are doing well in school. They have all the creature comforts, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, radios, television. They've got everything. And yet they're experiencing this frustration. We have women reporting like mental health breakdowns at larger rates than we've heard of before. We don't understand why. Women themselves don't understand why they feel this sort of like just this discomfort, this frustration. They're not sure what it's about. And so she does more research. She looks into how many women have college degrees that are now homemakers. They went out, they got all this education, and now they're sort of sitting at home, and this is what they're doing. They're not appreciate how many women are looking for jobs and are being sort of relegated to these sort of lower positions. What kinds of cultural messages are sent? This is one of just about a zillion ads I could show you. So this appears in an actual magazine. This is the ad for this ketchup. You mean a woman can open it? Can you believe it? There are other ads that look at, that show a woman, it's like, what does she want for her birthday? She wants a new vacuum cleaner, this is the thing that's gonna satisfy her. There's one, like a man has, like, his wife, like, across his lap, he's like gonna give her a spanking, and the caption is like, don't let your husband catch you buying whatever the other brand's coffee is, like, it's this idea that, like, women can only be satisfied, that they're not smart enough to do anything else, that, politicians, whenever they talk about women, it's always just in this respect of these are people to be taken care of, they're too fragile, they don't need any information about all this kind of stuff. And so Friedan looks at all of this, and her answer is, sort of one of the last chapters is called The Comfortable Concentration Camp. And in the book she writes that basically women are being placed in these comfortable concentration camps, the home. They are being isolated, they're being denied opportunities, and that the dissatisfaction, the problem that women are having is this disconnect between their potential, what they want to be able to do, and what society tells them they can do. Society is telling them that they are only able to do this one little thing, and that they have other aspirations. And this is the beginning of, so then we have, like, women's groups around the country, they have so-called consciousness-raising parties, so it's like, let's get together and talk about this. Like, and it's sort of electric, the effect that this has across the country. And it sounds dumb, like, from our perspective, like, did it really take someone to write a book to figure out that women didn't have opportunities? But think about it. If from birth to adulthood, as a woman, all you were ever told was, this is what your life is supposed to be about. You can go to college, that's cute, you're going to get married, then you're going to have children, you need to take care of your home, let's send you all these classes so you know how to fold the napkins just the right way, let's make sure that you dress just like this. This is who you're supposed to be. It wouldn't be that obvious that there were other options, right? Like, even today we talk about trying to make sure that girls know that math and science is cool for them, or that boys know that they can express their emotions. Like, even today we struggle with these, like, gendered ideas. So if just imagine in a world where we don't hear messages like International Women's Day, that it would have been a big deal. Betty Friedan's work sounds kind of like, why did she need to write that book? But it was huge. And so this is sort of the beginning of what we would call the modern women liberation movement, or the modern feminist movement. And we're going to see some activism after that. But before I jump into that, I do want to mention briefly about civil rights. So the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s is going to be, have significant involvement of women. So women are going to participate. Women are often even used as part of the movement. So for example, like in sit-ins or in like big marches, often the civil rights groups would specifically make sure that women were prominently placed because it makes for good press. right? If the racist bad guys are attacking nicely dressed, calm, attractive looking women, that looks really bad, right? That makes the racists look like they're being extra brutal, as opposed to like if we have a bunch of men, who are marching, that might be a little bit more intimidating. So women, just like they had before, are going to play a big role in the civil rights movement, but it gets complicated. So in 1968, there's a big shift in the civil rights movement. A bunch of things happen, like Martin Luther King is killed, and we have some race riots going on in the North. Anyway, there's a bunch of stuff going on. We'll get to that later. But in this year, we see this guy named Stokely Carmichael. He becomes the leader of the civil rights organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And when Stokely Carmichael comes in, he advances this ideology that really seeks to sort of repress women. You see, in the black community, women had always been, we might say, more liberated than white women had been, sort of by need, and not necessarily because it's like a good thing. But so because of oppression, black women had always really worked. There weren't a lot of black women who were like staying home, so they had always had this participation in society. Black women often are matriarchs, right? Especially if you think back like to slavery times, and like oftentimes men would be sold away from their families, and so women as matriarchs in the black community would have a lot of power, would have a lot of like social capital. They would direct a lot of the things that happen. Anyway, black women have always had this sort of like sense of power within their own community. And so Carmichael advocates this idea. It's not just his idea, but he advocates for this idea that suggests that like black men have been emasculated by oppression, and that therefore black women's jobs should be to be subservient to black men. That if black women are advocating for their rights, if black women are strong and in public and like taking leadership roles, that all they're doing is serving to like continue this like oppression of black men. And so they should sit down, get out of the movement, get out of the spotlight. You can serve the coffee, you can bring and make the food for all the civil rights workers, but you should not be part of this movement in a visible way. And I really just point out this story just to kind of remind us of how complicated gender issues are. Like, even if we think about it, if we take it out of the gender context, we'll stick there for a minute. Like, there are many women, I don't know, maybe you know them, who don't want to call themselves a feminist. So a woman who doesn't want to say I'm a feminist, they go, oh, I'm not really feminist. Does that mean they don't think that women are equal? No, it's just that that word feminist has been associated with like man-hating, or like trying to bring men down, or trying to like make women superior, and that shouldn't be what feminism is about, but that's kind of the ideology. And another example would be like, which is not about gender, is thinking about like the current, like the Black Lives Matter movement. Why does Black Lives Matter meet so much hostility? Well, one of the reasons I think, if we start doing some reading, is because some people, white people, take that phrase Black Lives Matter to suggest Black lives ought to matter more, right? Like, white people matter too much. You should matter less. We should matter more. And that is an uncomfortable thing to think about. You don't want to think about somebody else getting their rights by pushing you down. So in the same way, this like gender study, like as it evolves, has really looked at how can women be raised up without trying to push men down. It's not about making men have less opportunities, or making men look bad, or making them sort of like pay, or making them subservient to women. It should be simply about finding equal opportunities and getting rid of barriers to women. But if barriers to women have helped men, then some men might feel challenged by, if we get rid of those barriers for women, well, now men have less of a step up. That can feel like being demoted, and it is complicated. So I just think that this civil rights case study is just kind of an interesting way to look at that complication. Okay, so into the 1970s, here's where we really see like the flowering of the like women's liberation movement. And so just like by way of terminology, if we just say the women's rights movement, that's kind of ambiguous and probably refers to like the battle for the 19th Amendment or something. But when we say the women's liberation movement, we are almost certainly talking about this time in the 60s and 70s. And so we see like a sexual liberation in the among women. So things like Griswold versus Connecticut, which is a Supreme Court case that makes access to makes access to birth control valid, and like the rising accessibility of birth control means that women can feel sort of more sexually liberated. This is sort of similar to like the cultural changes that we see for women in the 1920s. But then on a bigger scale, women are going to begin to challenge things that that they see as cultural elements of oppression. So it's not just about political rights, it's about cultural equality. So for example, this is Gloria Steinem. Her name is spelled Steinem. Gloria Steinem. And she is going to found something called Ms. Magazine, MS Magazine. And what is that? What is MS? What does that mean? Oh. Well, it means you're a woman, but it doesn't really mean anything else, right? Prior to using Ms., what's the option? Mrs., MRS, or Miss, MISS, right? But do men have that equivalent? Do we denote men by whether they're married or not? No, men, no matter what, they're just Mr. And so there is this sort of sense that, okay, when we denote women, they're either Miss Kelly or Mrs. Rodriguez. We're assigning value and authority and all of this based simply on their marital status. We're defining who they are with respect to their relationship to some man, and that's problematic. That women should have the same sort of like anonymity that men get. Like, my marital status has no bearing on who I am as a person. Like, it doesn't affect my value or my standing. So MS is advocated. No, we should just use Ms. It's neutral. No matter who you are, every woman can be a Ms. And this is much more respectful of like not defining a woman by her marital status. Betty Friedan, remember the lady who wrote Feminine Mystique? She founds an organization called the National Organization for Women. Now, it still exists today, and they're going to be pushing advocacy for things like, let's criminalize marital rape. So the idea that a husband can't just do whatever he wants to his wife, but that a wife still maintains bodily autonomy, this is a law that they have to like push for and advocate for. They're advocating for things like women should be able to get no-fault divorces. So for a long time, well into the 70s, men could file for divorce for any reason, just cause. But if a woman wanted to file for divorce, she had to be able to prove there was something the man had done. So like she had to prove that he was abusive, or that he didn't provide for the family, or that he had an affair going on or something. She had to prove there was something wrong that the man had done. But the man could file for no-fault divorce. So they're advocating for some of these like sort of smaller level things. We see like protests of the Miss America pageants. So at one of the big protests in the 70s, some women's rights groups, they come, and there are women who are like naked, and they like paint on their bodies like cuts of meat. And so they're like protesting for the idea that like the Miss America pageant is just putting women on display for like their bodies. Like, it doesn't value their abilities or their brains or their contribution to society. It's just valuing women for what they look like, and that this is like damaging to women's psyche. We see like the sort of famed bra burning. That's actually not that common. That doesn't happen very often. There's just a few like isolated instances. But we do begin to hear the conversation about women's fashion. So even today, girls' pockets, do they hold anything useful?
No.
No, women's pockets are worthless. Men's pockets, on the other hand, are nice and deep and can carry all kinds of exciting things that can help you like survive in the wilderness or something. I don't know. A water bottle. I can barely fit a piece of chapstick in my pocket. So
I love the style, a pocket-sized book. It's like,
yeah, yes. So, and then you think about other women's fashion, like things like pencil skirts, which were popular in the 60s. Can you do anything important in a pencil skirt? I mean, maybe, but you're not going to be able to like defend yourself or like go and you could carry your purse. Well, men can carry bags. That's not a black. High heels. Women's, like the idea of painting your nails, like all of these things, they're fashionable. These are things that we think that women should aspire to, but they are not practical, right? Whereas men's fashions or men's like trends are all much more freeing. So women begin to talk about like challenging this idea that women shouldn't have to just wear a dress every day. Why can't women wear pants? Like, there were rules that women could not wear pants to Congress. Like, women congressmen were not allowed to wear pants until a couple of like decades ago. So no, it was like 20 years ago. So this is a big deal, right? Like this notion about, just small things that began to be highlighted by this women's liberation movement. So then we get to the sad story of the ERA. So in the 1970s, there is a big push for support for women, and Congress overwhelmingly passes this Equal Rights Amendment. So if you don't remember, to pass a constitutional amendment, first, both houses of Congress have to vote by a 2/3 majority to propose the amendment, and then, after that, what has to happen? 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. So amendment is two-step process. First, Congress proposes by a supermajority, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify. So Congress goes has way more than 2/3 votes, like huge numbers of support in Congress, House and Senate. They've proposed this amendment that says the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. That's all it is. That's all it says. Equal Rights Amendment. Then it goes to the states. And early on, it seems great. You guys, Texas is one of the first states to ratify the ERA. Lots of states ratify the ERA. It required 38 states to ratify. And within about 2 years, they have 33, I think, votes. But then we see the organization of some anti-women's movement organizations. One of the most famous is called the Eagle Forum. The Eagle Forum. And it's led by this woman named Phyllis Schlafly, which is a really fun name to say. So Phyllis Schlafly. And the Eagle Forum and Phyllis Schlafly, they advocated for, they had this group called the Stop ERA campaign. And they went around to different states and they said things like, hey, if we pass the ERA, you're going to have unisex bathrooms. We won't be able to have men and women's bathrooms. Women are going to be drafted. Women are not going to be preferred, like mothers won't get protected custody of their children. We're going to see just the falling apart of society as we know it if we pass this, and it works. The original ERA had a 7-year timeline, so it had the Congress said that if it wasn't ratified in 7 years, they were going to rescind the proposal. They extend the deadline another 3 or 4 years, and still the ERA is 3 states shy of ratification, and it doesn't pass. It still hasn't passed. Still, there are several laws like the Equal Pay Act and Title IX and the Civil Rights Act, which say that you're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of gender, but it's not in the Constitution. It is not a constitutionally prohibited practice to discriminate on the basis of sex, and that's kind of a big deal. But it's proposed pretty much every year to Congress and has never again been passed by Congress. So still, there is no Equal Rights Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. The battle over reproductive rights has been another very divisive issue. So in the 60s, there was a case, Griswold versus Connecticut. And Griswold versus Connecticut establishes this idea of a right to privacy and says that women's right to privacy includes access to medical care, which in this case was birth control. So there were laws in Connecticut and many other states that said that unmarried women could not have access to birth control. Like their doctors could not prescribe them birth control. Birth control was only for married women. And so this court case overturns that and says, no, women have a right to have privacy in their health decisions, and if they and their doctor decide that birth control is what's right for them, then that's allowed. Then shortly thereafter, we get the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973 or 4. And Roe versus Wade then expands that and says the right to privacy not only extends to private medical decisions about birth control, but can also include the right to access to an abortion, and that no state can stop women from accessing an abortion in the first trimester and the second trimester, and can't do it in the third trimester unless they make provision for the woman's health. So these court cases are seen as big steps forward for women. This access to reproductive health care and like control over women's fertility is supposed to be arguably this way that helps women to sort of meet men on equal footing. Like if a woman wants to delay having children until later in her career, she should have the power to do that, and that having children shouldn't mean that women can't access the politics or access the business world or whatever, that women should be able to choose when or when not to have children. But it's also very controversial. So like the ERA, which fails because of conservative fears about what that would mean for gender relationships, the reproductive rights movement has also divided the women's movement, because although the bulk of the women's movement is squarely in line with this idea that reproductive rights are an important thing that should be fought for, on the other hand, there are also conservative women who feel alienated from the feminist movement, saying, well, I believe in equal rights, I want equal pay, I want equal access to government offices, I want more women in office, I want all of these things, but I think that abortion especially is problematic. And so this new division in the women's rights movement about what role reproductive rights, what role abortion especially, plays in like liberation for women is a new place where women really are struggling. Now it's not just about women's rights. Feminism is often associated with things like abortion, and so conservative women may be less likely to want to identify with that particular role. So I will just conclude today with a look at sort of modern politics. There are some bright spots. We had, this is Geraldine Ferraro. She was the first woman to ever be on the ticket for one of the two major parties. She was the vice presidential candidate in 1984. She didn't win. Well, her running partner didn't win. Then we had Hillary Clinton, the first woman ever to be the presidential nominee for either of the major parties. She didn't win either, but that's another step in the right direction. We have had many female Supreme Court we've had 4 women Supreme Court justices. So, no, only 4 ever in the history of the United States. So Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, this is Sonia Sotomayor, she was the first Latina Supreme Court justice, and Elena Kagan. We've got more women representatives and senators than ever before, but it still only amounts to 20%. There are 21 senators and women senators, and 20.1% of the U.S. House of Representatives is female. So there is still a lot of ground to be covered. One of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow are some of the reasons for the gaps that still exist today, and there's a lot of nuance there. It's not as clear-cut as like misogyny. Like there are a lot of things that women choose that might limit their choices later on. So okay, excellent job.